Hey everyone, today on Cosmophoto's YouTube channel we are going to look at one of the classic cult compacts from the 1980s, the Cosina CX-2. The Cosina CX-2 is a zone focus camera. So when you want to focus with one of these cameras, you're basically setting the camera to a series of focus zones where everything should be reasonably in focus. So this was quite a popular type of camera throughout the 60s, 70s and 80s. And it kind of got a second wind with the rising automation of compact cameras throughout the 1980s. We had quite a few designs that used this zone focus system. The reason was that it made the cameras cheaper to build compared to say a rangefinder system, which needed to be very accurate and was quite complicated, and also compared to autofocus, which really was in its infancy in the early 1980s. Autofocus sort of promised a lot for camera manufacturers, but the sort of rising automation at the time meant that cameras really had to be rethought. Camera designers suddenly had to try and make room for things like motorized film transport. So with a camera like this using zone focus, it's a lot simpler, a lot easier to build. So the CX-2 was launched in 1980 at the Photokina photographic trade show in Cologne in what was then West Germany. The CX-2 was launched alongside a simpler version of the camera, which was the CX-1. The big differences between these two cameras was the CX-1 had a slightly slower lens, a slightly less sharp lens, and it also lacked the self-timer that you can see here on the front of the CX-2. So essentially they released the CX-1 and an improved CX-1 at the same time. And this camera only lasted in production for maybe 3 or 4 years before being superseded by other CX designs that Cosina was making. But it kind of had a second life in the 1990s and 2000s with the Lomography craze, which we're going to get into a little bit further on in the video. But I just wanted to talk about some of the interesting features of this camera and why a lot of compact film photography fans still using them to this day. So one of the really interesting aspects of this camera is the front plate when the camera is closed. So as you can see here, there's a sort of vaguely rectangular faceplate on the camera. And how do you open it? Well, you could probably spend a few minutes searching for a button and scratch your heads, but quite an ingenious piece of industrial design, as 35mmC once put it. You just twist this front plate to the side, and as you can see, in doing so, you not only move the faceplate, you're actually opening the cover, and the lens is ready to use. You wind the camera on, in this case it's actually wound on, ready to shoot. So this is a zone focus compact. It's pretty pocketable, a little bit chunkier than some maybe, but a very small camera to fit the palm of your hand. At the heart of it is a really lovely lens, a 5-element 35mm lens, a Cosina 35mm lens. This has a maximum aperture of f2.8, and it renders colors really well, great contrast, pretty good at keeping flare out, and it has this mild vignetting effect around the corners sometimes, which is atmospheric rather than sort of really getting in the way of the composition. So the lens is a really nice little 35mm lens for a compact camera. But there's another aspect to this camera which makes it intriguing. Over here you can see that the camera has various apertures that it can be set to. So when you did this, you were changing the aperture, but you couldn't change the shutter speed. So basically you had the one shutter speed, which I think is 1/60th. I mean, I've been shooting with these cameras for well over a decade, and I've never used them on these manually selectable aperture settings. And that's because right at the bottom of here you have auto. And that's really where this camera comes alive. Basically, when you set the camera on auto, you are allowing the camera's exposure system to choose both the shutter and the aperture, and it will do that depending on how much light is available. So the thing about this camera's auto exposure system, it's not the most sensitive in terms of an EV range. So, the highest ISO number that you can set on it is ISO 400, but it will keep the camera's shutter open for as long as 30 seconds. And that means that you can get some really interesting shots, late at night or in a bar, or, driving on a road at night with, car headlights coming towards you. You can just basically keep the shutter open and it will keep going and going and going and going and going until the camera decides that it's got enough light. Really good for doing sort of light trails, that kind of stuff. A lot of photographers sort of rediscovered this camera in the 1990s with the advent of the Lomography movement. So they would use sort of expired films. They'd also use things like this film, Kodak Elite Chrome 100 Extra Color. This is a particularly good film for cross-processing, and that is to say, taking a slide film, in this instance, this is an E6 slide film, and developing it in C41 chemicals, color negative chemicals. And what that does is it sort of plays around with the saturation, with the color bias, with the contrast, and you can get some really interesting effects. Each slide film sort of behaved a little bit differently. The good thing about Elite Chrome 100 Extra Color was that it had a sort of bias towards golds and reds and blues, particularly eye-popping shades of those. So if you shot the stuff on a camera like the CX-2 in very bright light, really eye-popping colors. So the Cosina helped sort of create a bit of a cult of this sort of experimental shooting with compact cameras. And that's partly because of the camera that it helped create, which is this one, which is the LOMO LC-A. Now this was a copy of the CX-2, which was produced in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Now production of these kept going until the early 1990s. Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of Russian industry sort of hit hard times, and the camera went out of production. But it was kind of rescued by a bunch of Austrian art students who discovered these in Prague in the early 1990s and found that it had these interesting features like the shutter staying open for a long time, much like the Cosina. The Lomography movement, which led to films like this coming out, Lomography Metropolis, was sort of built off the backs of the LOMO LC-A, which was brought back into production in the 1990s in St. Petersburg. But really the godfather of that whole movement is this camera, the CX-2. Now, you look at the LC-A and you see that it doesn't have the self-timer, so perhaps aesthetically it looks most like the CX-1. But I think it was this camera, the CX-2, that really got the camera designers back in Leningrad, as it was in the time, excited. And the CX-2 was a really interesting concept for a camera with this completely different way of interacting with the lens. I've never seen a twisting faceplate on another camera in quite the same style. If you compare it to this LC-A, you can see that the Russians just couldn't copy it in quite the same way, so you have a much simpler slider on the bottom. The CX-2 was only kept in production for a few years, but it came with a number of quite interesting accessories that made it, in a sort of humble way, a bit of a system camera. So the first of which was a little flash that you could pop on the hot shoe here, and if you shot the camera with the flash, then it would choose a shutter speed of 1/45th, so you could get some quite interesting light trail effects in the background, still using flash. It also came with a motor winder, an electric motor wind, which could be fitted onto the bottom of the camera. And it even came with an underwater housing, so you could pop the CX-2 and its flash into a proper underwater housing, and take it down into the briny deep, and you know, live out your Jacques Cousteau fantasies as long as the film lasted in the camera, which is an interesting array of accessories for what's quite a humble little camera. I mean, I think this was pretty much just designed as a holiday camera. You can find compact cameras like this on our online camera store, Camera Bureau, and you can also see plenty of articles on cameras like this on the blog Cosmophoto. Thanks for watching.